After her heartless words, the human took off his armor and walked away. The horizon's edge was a ship built for peace. At least, that's what Jake Morrison had always told himself. It had been 8 years since he first boarded it, 8 years since he swore an oath to protect and serve the Coalition. Jake had been through countless missions, seen the horrors of battle and felt the sting of loss, but this was different. Today had been something else entirely. Jake stood in the armory, staring at the reflection in the metal walls. His uniform was torn in places, caked in dirt and blood, some of it his own, some from others. His hands trembled as he wiped them down under the cold stream of water from the sink, but it wasn't just the blood that left his hands shaking. It was the weight of the loss. The battle had been a bloodbath, one that dragged on for 3 brutal hours. They fought to protect the Varani colony on Theta 7, and while they had succeeded in saving the colony, the cost was steep. 15 human lives lost, 23 others were wounded. Jake had carried 2 of them to the medbay himself, but one of them, Chris Webb, a kid barely 22, had died in his arms before they could even get to the medical team. He could still hear Chris's final words, a last plea about his family back on Earth. "Just hold on," Jake had told him, but Chris didn't. Jake turned away from the sink, gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. Every part of him screamed for release. The grief, the anger, the exhaustion. He had given everything today. And for what? A knock broke through his thoughts. He recognized the footsteps before the knock even came, long, rhythmic, measured. Commander Lyra. The woman who had stood by his side in so many battles. The woman who was more than a commander, she had been his friend. Until now. Jake didn't need to turn around to know what was coming. Her voice rang out, cold and measured, as if she had practiced the words long before she ever walked into the room. "We lost 40 Varani soldiers today," she said. Jake's heart dropped. He had known it was bad, but hearing it spoken out loud, he wasn't ready for that. "I know," he replied softly, his voice betraying none of the shock or grief he felt. He had known, but hearing it from Lyra, hearing the weight of it from her, hit harder than he expected. "And we lost 15 humans," she continued, her eyes unwavering, her tone cold. Good people, good people." Her words cut deeper than any wound he had received. 15 of his comrades, gone, dead. Jake wanted to say something to make her understand. He wanted to scream, to lash out. He had lost so much. How could she talk about it like this? But he didn't. He just stood there, fists clenched, trying to hold it together. Lyra stepped closer, the silence between them stretching. She spoke again, her voice tinged with something unfamiliar. Disappointment, maybe. Anger, grief. "Your people," she said slowly, "threw themselves at the enemy like animals. No strategy, no thought, just charging forward to die." The words hit Jake like a slap. Animals, his people. He had fought beside these men and women for years. He had seen them sacrifice, seen them give everything they had. How could she call them animals? Jake opened his mouth to speak, but Lyra wasn't finished. Her gaze was sharp, cutting. "Do you know what the council says about humans?" Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "Do you know what we really think of your kind?" He didn't answer. He didn't know if he even wanted to hear it. "You are weapons," she said, her voice cold, as if she had been waiting to say it all along. "Disposable weapons. That is all humans are to the Coalition." Jake's stomach twisted. He wanted to turn around, to walk away, to escape, but his feet were rooted to the spot. This wasn't just about the battle anymore. This was about something deeper, something Jake had never thought to question. "You throw yourselves into every battle," Lyra continued, "because you are too simple to understand what you are dying for. You think you are partners. You think you are equals." Each word she spoke cut deeper, like a blade pressing into his chest. He had given everything for this. His sweat, his blood, his brothers and sisters in arms. And now he was being told that he had been nothing more than a tool, nothing more than a pawn in a game that he didn't even know he was playing. Lyra's voice grew quieter, but the weight of her words didn't lighten. "We pity you," she said softly. "You are like eager dogs, so desperate for approval that you will do anything. You mistake servitude for friendship." The words landed like a gut punch. He had always told himself that they were fighting together, that they were equals. But now Lyra was telling him that everything he had sacrificed, everything he had believed, was nothing but a lie. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. How could he respond to this? What could he say that would make sense of what she had just told him? "Stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No," Lyra's tone was firm, final. "You need to hear this." She stepped closer, her silver eyes locked onto his. Jake felt something cold spread through him. There was no anger in her expression anymore, just something else. Something that made him feel small, like a child who had been caught in a lie. "The truth is simple, Jake," she said, almost too quietly to hear. "Humanity's only value to the Coalition is your willingness to die. You breathe fast. You recover fast. You are proud of your sacrifices, but you never stop to ask why you are always the ones making them." Jake's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. Every word hit like a hammer, smashing his beliefs, his trust. He had always believed he was a hero, that the sacrifices meant something. But now, Lyra was telling him he had been a tool, nothing more than a resource to be used. The words rattled around in his head like a storm. He couldn't take it, couldn't stand to hear it anymore. He could feel something breaking inside of him, not with a loud snap but quietly, like a rope fraying over time, giving way to something else. "Enough," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper, the strength in it surprising even him. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything. And for the first time, Jake felt the distance between them. Not just the physical distance, but the space that had opened up between them, something that could never be repaired. He didn't look at her again. Instead, he walked to his locker, opened it slowly, and began to strip off his armor. Each piece felt heavier than the last: the chest plate, the arm guards, the boots. His service, his past, felt like an anchor pulling him down. He had fought and bled for this life, for this uniform. But now, it no longer felt like a symbol of honor. It felt like a cage. "What are you doing?" Lyra's voice finally broke through the silence, sharp with disbelief. Jake didn't respond. He just kept going, one piece at a time, until he stood in his basic uniform, feeling lighter than he had in years. He reached for his service pistol, the one he had carried for 8 long years, the one that had saved his life more times than he could count. He set it down beside his armor, and as he stood there staring at it, he realized something. He didn't need it anymore. "I'm done," Jake said quietly, his voice steady. He turned toward the door and walked away. The truth that stings. Jake Morrison had always believed in the bond between him and his comrades. The Horizon's Edge wasn't just a ship to him, it had been home for 8 years. He had fought beside Lyra, shared meals with her, and laughed together in the quiet moments between battles. They had shared victories and defeats, celebrated successes, and mourned their losses. There was a camaraderie, an unspoken trust that had always held them together, or so he thought. As Jake walked away from the armory, the weight of Lyra's words clung to him like a cold fog. Every step he took felt heavier than the last. He had hoped, no, he had convinced himself, that the Varani commander had spoken in anger, that grief and pain had twisted her perspective. But as he replayed her words in his mind, there was no denying the truth, no comforting denial to fall back on. Lyra had said it all so coldly, so matter-of-factly. Humans were disposable, weapons to be used, then discarded. Jake's hands clenched at his sides as he walked down the corridor. The ship, once familiar, now felt alien to him. His mind was in turmoil. The pride he had once felt about his service, about his role in the Coalition, was turning to dust. He had always known that war was brutal, that sacrifices were part of the job. But this was different. This wasn't about duty. This was about a system that saw humans as nothing more than expendable pawns. The truth hurt, but more than that, it terrified him. For the first time, Jake questioned everything he had believed. Was it really just about dying for a cause? Were they really just tools for a higher purpose? Had his life been nothing but a series of commands to follow, a countdown to his inevitable sacrifice? His mind raced as he entered his quarters. His armor, stripped off and discarded on the bench, stood as a silent reminder of what he had left behind. He closed the door behind him, shut out the noise of the ship, and tried to breathe. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His heart sank. He didn't need to open it to know who was standing on the other side. Lyra. She had come to find him. He had expected this. She wouldn't let it go. She couldn't. This wasn't just a conversation to her. It was a confrontation, and there would be no going back after this. He opened the door slowly, and there she stood. Commander Lyra, tall and proud, her silver skin dimmer than usual as though drained of the energy that had once radiated from her. Her eyes were tired, haunted. There was no anger in her gaze now, no sharp edge to her voice, but the words were just as painful. "I need to apologize," she said, her voice quieter than Jake had ever heard it. The hardness was gone, replaced with something softer, something raw. Jake said nothing. What was there to say? He had never expected an apology from her, not for this. She had meant every word, and somehow that made it worse. Lyra's eyes dropped to the floor for a moment, as if she were gathering her thoughts, as if the weight of what she had said was finally sinking in. Then she looked up at him again, her expression pained. "I was wrong," she said, the words coming out in a breathless rush. "I was grieving. I was angry, and I let that anger shape everything I said, but the truth is, humans aren't weapons. You're not disposable." Jake's throat tightened, but he didn't respond. He didn't want to hear it. He couldn't. Lyra's voice faltered as she continued. "I've watched you, Jake. I've seen how your people fight. You don't do it because you're told to. You do it because you believe in something. You fight for each other, for something greater. And I couldn't see that. I couldn't see past my own grief to understand what was really happening." She stepped forward, her eyes filled with regret. "I thought I understood," she said, her voice low. "I thought I understood what it meant to fight with honor, to give everything for the greater good. But what I failed to see was that your people, you, Jake, you don't give everything because you're forced to. You do it because you choose to, and that choice is what makes you different." Jake stood there, frozen. Her words weren't the comfort he had hoped for. They weren't enough to heal the wound Lyra had opened with her earlier words, but they did something. They planted a seed of doubt in his mind, a crack in the armor of certainty he had built over the years. "Why now?" Jake finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Why say this now after everything?" Lyra hesitated, and for a moment it seemed like she was looking for the right words, words that would somehow fix everything. "Because I was wrong, Jake, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to understand that I never saw you or your people the way I do now. I'm sorry." Jake stared at her, the silence stretching between them. Was this enough? Was an apology enough to undo the damage, to erase the years of service that had been reduced to nothing in an instant? The truth had hit harder than anything he had ever faced, and Lyra's apology, no matter how sincere, didn't change what was already done. It didn't take away the sting of those words. Disposable weapons. But there was something else in her eyes now, something Jake hadn't seen before. It wasn't just regret. It was respect. Real respect. She had seen something in him, in humans, that she hadn't been able to see before. Maybe she wasn't the only one who needed to learn something. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong too. Jake didn't know how to answer. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He just stood there, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had been lost. But in that silence, something shifted. The gap between them, the one Lyra had created with her cruel words, had begun to close. It wouldn't be fixed overnight. It couldn't be. But it was a start. "Thank you for the apology," Jake finally said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. But I can't go back to what we were. Things have changed. Lyra nodded, her eyes not leaving his. I understand. I just wanted you to know the truth. As she turned to leave, Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The truth was out. It had hurt, it had broken him, but maybe it was the only way forward. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he could ever look at Lyra the same way again. But one thing was clear. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that armory hours ago. The journey had just begun. Breaking point. Jake Morrison had never been one for regret. He was a soldier, trained to make decisions in the heat of battle, to move forward without hesitation. But as he sat on the edge of his bunk in his quarters, staring at the empty space in front of him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shattered. The horizon's edge had always felt like a second home. He had given it 8 years of his life, fought and bled for the coalition, stood by his friends. He had believed in what they were doing, in the partnerships they had forged with the other species. He believed that they were fighting for something bigger, something meaningful. But Lyra's words had cut through that belief like a hot knife. She had torn down everything he had once stood for. And now, all that was left was the raw truth. Humans weren't partners, they weren't equals, they were expendable. He could still hear her voice, cold and unfeeling, telling him that his people were like eager dogs, desperate for approval, throwing themselves into battle without a second thought, without a plan, without purpose. That's what it boiled down to, didn't it? Humans were nothing more than tools, pawns in a game they didn't understand, and he had been a fool to think otherwise. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides and his breath hitched. The anger was rising again, but this time it wasn't just anger, it was something else, something deeper, betrayal, a quiet realization that maybe he had been wrong to fight for this, to fight for the coalition. Maybe it wasn't about making a difference. Maybe it was about dying for something that didn't even care about him. He glanced at the locker across from his bunk, where his armor sat, his chest plate, his shoulder guards, the boots that had carried him through so many battles. It all seemed so meaningless now. The weight of it felt heavier than it ever had before. The armor that had once been a symbol of pride, of service, now felt like a prison. He had worn it for years, been promoted, climbed the ranks, and earned respect. Or so he thought. The truth was starting to sink in like a slow poison. Lyra had been right about one thing. Humans were good at dying. They could take the pain, take the loss, and keep pushing forward. But at what cost? What did they gain from all that sacrifice? A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Jake didn't need to open it to know who was standing on the other side. It was Lyra again. Her footsteps were heavier now, quieter, as if she was carrying something with her, something more than just an apology. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the weight of her own realization. Jake didn't answer immediately. He sat still, his hands resting on his knees. He had no desire to talk to her, not right now. What was there to say? What could she possibly say that would undo what had already been done? Jake, Lyra's voice came through the door, hesitant, unsure. I need to speak with you. He stood up and walked slowly to the door, opening it just enough to see her standing there, her silver skin dim in the dim light of the corridor. She looked exhausted, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. And maybe, in a way, it was. I'm not here to apologize again, she began, her voice softer than before, more vulnerable. I know I can't take back what I said. I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know I didn't mean it. Jake didn't reply, he just looked at her. He didn't need more words, more excuses. What she had said had already been said. There was no going back from that. Lyra took a deep breath, clearly struggling to find the right words. I don't expect you to understand, not yet, but I need you to know that what I said wasn't the full truth. It was just grief talking, anger talking. I've seen too many of our people die. I've watched our world burn, and I let that make me blind. I let it make me forget that the humans I fought beside weren't just soldiers. They were people. Jake felt a bitter chuckle rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. You're right, he said, his voice cold. You were blind, you've always been. I don't know why I thought we were partners. You've always seen us as tools. You just didn't care to say it out loud." Lyra flinched, the words hitting her like a physical blow. Jake saw the hurt flash in her eyes, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. The truth was out. She had already exposed herself, and there was nothing left for him to do but walk away from it. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said quietly. "I thought we were building something together, but I can see now that I was wrong." Jake felt a pang of something in his chest, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had no room for sympathy anymore. He had no room for anything. Not after everything he had just learned. Not after everything he had just lost. "Jake," Lyra began again, but her voice was softer this time, hesitant. "I don't expect you to come back. I don't even know if you can forgive me. But I'm asking you, please, don't walk away from all of us. Don't walk away from everything we've fought for." Jake stared at her for a long moment, his gaze hard. He could feel the pull of something deep within him, something that wanted to forgive her, something that wanted to believe in the good of the coalition. But the truth was too heavy now. He couldn't unsee it. "You don't get it, Lyra," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet pain. "I'm not walking away from the coalition. I'm walking away from a lie. I'm walking away from being someone's weapon. I didn't join this war to be used and discarded. I joined to make a difference. But you're right. I never made a difference, not in the way I thought." He turned away from her, the decision settling deep in his chest like a cold stone. "I'm done," Jake said, his voice low. "I'm done being a pawn, and I'm done being your soldier. You're going to have to figure out how to win this war without me." Lyra didn't try to stop him. She didn't even speak. She just stood there, frozen, watching as Jake walked away, leaving behind the man he had been and stepping into an uncertain future. The truth was, Jake didn't know what came next. He didn't know where his path would lead. But one thing was clear. Whatever happened, he would never be anyone's disposable weapon again. Homecoming, but the fight isn't over. The transport shuttle's hum was oddly soothing as Jake Morrison gazed out the window. His eyes were locked on the vast expanse of space outside, the stars shining like distant, indifferent beacons. There was a strange emptiness in the pit of his stomach, one that had settled in after he had walked away from the horizon's edge, after he had walked away from everything he had known for the past 8 years. The crew, the mission, the uniform, it all seemed so distant now. He had discarded it all, leaving it behind like a ghost that wouldn't let him move on. The journey back to New Haven, the colony he had left behind so long ago, felt like a lifetime. When he had enlisted, New Haven had been little more than a small collection of prefab buildings and makeshift farms. The place had been full of promise and hope, a place where humanity could grow, expand, and thrive. But now, as he neared his destination, he realized that New Haven had changed. It wasn't the sleepy, struggling outpost he remembered. It had evolved into something real, something alive. Tall buildings reached for the sky, and the streets were filled with people moving purposefully, their lives not governed by the rhythms of war, but by the rhythms of normality. Jake leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He didn't know what he expected when he left the horizon's edge. He hadn't imagined a grand homecoming, but something more than this quiet return to a colony that had long since moved on without him. For the first time in 8 years, he wasn't a soldier. He was just Jake. When the shuttle finally docked at New Haven Station, Jake stood up slowly, his muscles sore and stiff from the long journey. As he walked down the ramp, he felt the weight of his past life on him, pulling him back even as the station's bustling activity seemed to urge him forward. The air, fresh with the scent of plants and open space, felt like a dream. In the distance, he could hear the hum of farming machinery, the busy chatter of traders, and the sounds of children laughing. This was the world he had left behind, the world that had moved on. And then a familiar face appeared through the crowd, Amy. Jake's little sister had changed too. The last time he had seen her, she was barely an adult, a teenager struggling to figure out her place in the world. Now she was a woman, confident, strong, and standing tall as she ran toward him with a grin on her face. Her brown hair flew out behind her as she approached, and before he could even speak, she crashed into him with a hug so tight it nearly knocked him over. "Jake, what the hell? You didn't tell me you were coming back," Amy exclaimed, pulling back just enough to look at him. "And you look like you've been through hell." Jake smiled weakly, but it didn't reach his eyes. His sister's concern made something inside of him tighten. He hadn't been ready to face the truth of what he had been through. Not yet. "I'm fine," he muttered, trying to reassure her with words that felt hollow. "Liar," she shot back with a knowing smile. Amy took his bag from him with ease and hooked her arm around his. "Come on, you're staying with me, and you are going to tell me everything, all of it." Jake let her guide him through the crowd. He didn't resist. Amy had always been the one to pull him back from the edge when he didn't have the strength to find his way. She had been his anchor during the quieter days when things felt like they could fall apart. It was strange, though. He had hoped for peace, for a break from the war, but now that he was home, it felt like he was carrying a heavier burden than ever. The truth about what the coalition thought of him, of humans, still stung, and he didn't know how to begin talking about it with anyone, let alone his sister. They arrived at Amy's apartment. It wasn't much, just a small place above the medical clinic where she worked, but it was home. Cozy, filled with plants and books, with a hint of warm food drifting from the kitchen. It wasn't the sterile, cold environments of military ships or space stations. It was real. It was alive. It was the kind of place Jake had forgotten existed. Amy insisted he sit at the table while she made them something to eat. "I know you've been living off military rations for the last 8 years, so I'm going to make you something that actually tastes like food." Jake smiled, but it felt forced. He sat at the table, watching her move around the small kitchen. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence you shared with someone you knew deeply. Still, the weight of his thoughts pressed on him. Amy came over with a plate of food and sat across from him. "So," she said, diving right into the conversation, "why are you here? I mean, I know you resigned, but that's not exactly something you do without a reason. You don't just throw away 8 years of your life like that." Jake looked down at the food in front of him, pushing it around with his fork. "I needed a change, I guess," he said, trying to sound casual. But even to him, his words felt like an excuse. Amy raised an eyebrow, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "That's the worst lie you've ever told me." Jake sighed. She was right. He could never get away with pretending with her. She always saw through him. "I don't know if I can explain it," he said quietly, pushing the food aside. "The battle, everything that happened. Lyra," she said, things that made me realize I've been fighting for the wrong reasons. I thought I was doing something good, but I don't know anymore." Amy's smile faded as she leaned forward, her eyes studying him carefully. "You're not in trouble, are you?" "No," Jake said, his voice steady. "Not trouble, just confusion, a lot of it." Amy reached across the table and grabbed his hand, squeezing it gently. "Jake, you've been through a lot. You've seen things, I get that. But don't let one person's words make you forget who you are. You've always been more than what the coalition sees you as. You're not just some soldier who throws himself into battle. You're my brother, and you've always made your own path." Jake looked at her, his throat tight. "I don't know who I am without the uniform." Amy smiled softly. "You're Jake, that's enough." Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake let himself breathe. It wasn't the answer he had been looking for, but it was the one he needed. A reminder that there was more to life than the battles he had fought, more to him than the soldier he had been. That night, after a long talk and a long overdue rest, Jake knew one thing for sure: he wasn't done yet. The fight wasn't over, but it wasn't about following orders anymore. It was about choosing what was right on his own terms. Tomorrow he would figure it out, but for tonight he would rest. The road ahead was uncertain, but he wasn't walking it alone. The call to action. Jake's first night back in New Haven was unsettling. He had spent so many years focused on survival, on fighting, that now, in the quiet of his sister's apartment, it felt as though his entire life had been held together by threads. His eyes kept drifting to the window, to the lights of the colony below, where people went about their lives in peace. The sound of laughter, of everyday conversations. It was all so normal. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his world had shifted, and not in a way that could be undone. He had walked away from the horizon's edge, from everything that had defined him. And yet, even now, as he sat at the table, a cup of tea in front of him, he could feel the pull of that past life. It was like a shadow, following him everywhere he went. Even the simple act of looking out the window felt like he was caught between two worlds, the one he had left and the one he had yet to build. The truth about Lyra's words still lingered in his mind. Humans as disposable weapons. Was that really all they were to the Coalition? Had he truly been just another tool to be used, then thrown away when they were done? The doubt gnawed at him even as he tried to move past it. But he couldn't. The war wasn't over. The threat of the Kraith hung over them all, and even here in New Haven, the war was never truly gone. He knew that. As the days passed, Jake tried to adjust. He went through the motions, helping Amy with her work, occasionally visiting the spaceport to keep his hands busy, but it didn't feel right. The emptiness that had settled deep inside him wouldn't go away. He had walked away from one kind of service, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that he was meant for something else. Something bigger than just fixing ships and living a quiet life. And then the messages started coming in. At first it was just a trickle, small things. A message from Tyle, the young Veroni soldier Jake had saved during the last battle. Tyle had been a rookie at the time, terrified of dying. But Jake had stayed with him, kept him calm, promised him he would make it through. Tyle's message wasn't asking for help. It was just a thank you. Simple, heartfelt. You were right. I made it out because of you. I'm helping with the evacuation now. Just wanted you to know I'm still here. Jake sat with the message for a long time. It was simple, but it hit him in a way he didn't expect. Maybe that was the hardest part, the small acts of kindness, the small moments that had meant so much more than he had ever realized. He hadn't been alone out there. He had made a difference. And then there were more messages, from others on the horizon's edge. From Sarah Lopez, the medic who had worked with him after countless battles. From Cross, the Zenthari engineer who had helped him with a critical repair mission during the Theta 7 assault. Each message was a small memory, a little piece of the person Jake had been, a reminder of what he had done and why. He sat at the table, reading through them, his heart heavy but also full. These weren't just people who had fought alongside him. These were people who had respected him, who had cared about him, and they didn't see him as just a soldier. They saw him as someone who made a difference, as someone worth remembering. The truth about Lyra's words, it was still there, lurking in the background, but something was shifting inside Jake. He wasn't the only one who had been affected by this war. He wasn't the only one who had seen things, who had sacrificed. Everyone who had fought had their own story, their own battles to face. And maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to something worth fighting for. That's when the call came. Jake was at the spaceport, helping out with some routine maintenance when his comm device pinged. It was a secure message, encrypted, urgent. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it still made Jake's chest tighten. "Jake, it's Colonel Hayes. We need to talk." Jake paused, his hand hovering over a ship's panel. He hadn't spoken to Colonel Hayes since he left the horizon's edge. Hayes had been one of the few people to respect Jake's decision to resign. There was no pressure, no condemnation. Hayes had understood, but Jake knew that understanding had limits. The war was still out there, and the Coalition needed all the help it could get. "I know you've made your decision," Hayes said, his voice calm but tinged with urgency. "But there's something you need to see, a new threat. We're calling it the Kraith, and they've already begun attacking Coalition space." Jake's breath caught. The Kraith. He had heard the name in passing, but it had been nothing more than a rumor, a whisper of a far-off danger, but this was different, this was real. They've attacked 6 worlds already, Hayes continued. 3 are already lost. We're losing ground and fast. We need help. You're not in the military anymore, but I'm asking you, Jake. You know how to fight. You know how to survive out there. We need people like you. Jake's hand tightened on the comm device, his mind racing. The Kraith were unlike anything the Coalition had faced before: organic ships, weapons that could tear through a fleet, tactics that were unrecognizable. No one had any idea how to fight them, but Jake did. He knew how to adapt, how to think on his feet. He had done it countless times before. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered under his breath, half to himself. "I walked away from this. I walked away from the war, and now you're asking me to come back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jake could hear Hayes sigh, a deep, resigned sound. "I'm not asking you to come back to the military, Jake. I'm asking you to help, as yourself, as the person who knows what needs to be done. We need volunteers, independent forces, people who aren't bound by the Coalition's red tape. And you've got a reputation. People would follow you. You can lead them." The words hung in the air. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of it all. He had made a choice. He had walked away from being someone's tool, someone's weapon. But now, as the threat of the Kraith loomed larger, he was faced with a choice again. The right choice. Jake stood up slowly, his gaze drifting toward the door, towards the life he had left behind. "I'm not coming back as a soldier," Jake said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'll fight, on my own terms, for the right reasons." Hayes's voice was steady. "Good, you'll be leading a volunteer force. People who choose to fight. Let me know when you're ready. Time's running out." Jake looked out over the spaceport, the stars glimmering in the distance. The war was never truly over, not for him. But this time, he wouldn't fight because he had to. He would fight because it was the right thing to do. The call to action had come, and Jake was ready. Creating something new. The morning after the call, Jake stood at the spaceport, feeling the cool breeze of New Haven against his face. He had walked away from the military, from the horizon's edge, from everything he had known. He had hoped that would bring peace, that he could escape the chaos of war. But peace was elusive. The threat of the Kraith, the loss of worlds, the cries for help, it all pulled at him in ways he couldn't ignore. He wasn't the man he had been on the horizon's edge, the one who followed orders and wore the uniform. That part of him was gone, buried with the weight of Lyra's words and the truth they had revealed. But there was still something inside him, a fire that refused to be extinguished. Jake had learned that he didn't have to fight for someone else's approval. He could fight for something greater, for what was right. But if he was going to fight again, it had to be on his terms. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out to see a new message from Colonel Hayes. "Meeting at 10. We need to talk about what comes next." Jake slid the phone back into his pocket and walked toward the spaceport's hangar. He had made a decision the night before, staring out into the darkness, feeling the weight of the future pressing down on him. If he was going to lead again, he needed a new kind of army. Not a military force bound by rules and orders, but a group of people who chose to fight because they believed in the cause, not because they had to. Jake's eyes scanned the hangar as he entered. The space was filled with crates, repair equipment, and the low hum of activity as workers moved about. The ships they had, while functional, were far from sleek or sophisticated. They were built for utility, not grandeur, perfect for the free companies, the volunteer force Jake was about to create. He had no desire for glory, no desire to follow the same old military playbook that had failed so many times before. The Coalition was losing the war against the Kraith, and the thought of going back to old tactics, bland, predictable, and bound by regulations, made him sick. He knew the only way to make a real difference was to fight outside of that system, outside of the lines they'd drawn. "Ben, Lisa," Jake called out across the hangar. Ben Carter, a burly man with a broad smile, looked up from the pile of tools he was sorting. His wife. Lisa stood nearby, talking to one of the engineers. They were two of the people Jake had met since returning to New Haven. They weren't soldiers. They weren't even military. But Ben had the heart of a fighter, and Lisa was smart as a whip. They had both offered their help when Jake explained his idea. Ben raised a hand and waved, his grin never wavering. "Jake, you're early. Thought you might have slept in after all that excitement yesterday." "Excitement? I think it's called war, Ben," Jake replied dryly, walking over to them. "Well, whatever you want to call it," Ben said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're sure about this, right? Starting a volunteer force. You know it's gonna get messy, right?" Jake nodded, his expression serious. "It won't be easy, but it's the only way we can make a real difference. We're not going back to being soldiers under someone else's orders. The Coalition's fighting a war they're not ready for. The Kraith, they're unlike anything we've seen. But I'm not going to follow their playbook. We have to do this our way." Lisa, who had been quietly listening, stepped forward. "So, what's the plan? What do you need from us?" Jake glanced at the various ships and pieces of equipment scattered around the hangar. The sight of all the materials, most of them far from military grade, made his stomach churn with excitement. "I need volunteers. I need people who are willing to choose this. Not because they have to, but because they want to. People who understand that this fight isn't just about survival. It's about helping others. Doing what's right, not what's ordered." Ben nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You're not asking for a military unit. You're asking for an army of people who actually want to fight, not just follow orders." "That's exactly it," Jake said. "We're going to build our own army, one that isn't bound by the Coalition's red tape, one that chooses to fight because it's the right thing to do, not because we're told to. We'll fight smart, fight with purpose, and we'll be the ones who choose our battles, not someone sitting behind a desk." Lisa's expression softened. "You know, you're right about one thing. People have been throwing themselves at the Kraith blindly. Maybe they think they have no choice, or they think they're just following orders. But what if there's another way? What if we could show them there's more to this fight than just dying?" Jake's gaze hardened with determination. "That's the plan. We're going to fight in ways the Coalition never even considered. The Kraith are strong, but they're not invincible. If we fight smart, if we can be unpredictable, we might have a chance. But we need people who are willing to think outside the box, people who aren't just waiting for orders." Ben and Lisa exchanged a glance. Then Ben clapped his hands together. "All right, count me in. I'll help however I can, but you're gonna need more than just volunteers. You'll need equipment, weapons, ships. You can't fight a war with just what you've got here." "I know," Jake said, a smile tugging at his lips. "That's why I've already started talking to Colonel Hayes. He's gonna help us get some supplies, some gear, but we're also going to have to be creative. We don't need fancy military-grade stuff. We just need to be able to make it work, and we'll have to make some of it ourselves." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "So you want us to build a fleet from scrap? I'm in, but this is going to be a challenge." Jake grinned. "Exactly. We'll be unconventional, we'll be small, but we'll be strong. We'll hit them where it hurts. We'll use their own tactics against them." The three of them stood together in the hangar, surrounded by the tools and materials that would form the foundation of something new, something different. This wouldn't be a typical military unit. This would be a volunteer force, a group of individuals who chose to fight because they believed in what was right. Jake knew the road ahead would be difficult. He knew that the Kraith would test them, would push them to the brink. But he also knew one thing for sure. They had the power to change the way this war was fought. And that was something the Coalition, with all its resources, had never understood. "Let's get to work," Jake said, his voice firm. "It's time to build the free companies." And with that, they set to work, gathering materials, organizing volunteers, and preparing for the fight ahead. It was going to be tough. It was going to be messy. But for the first time in a long while, Jake felt something he hadn't felt since his days aboard the Horizon's Edge. Hope. Not the kind that came from following orders, but the kind that came from choosing to fight for what was right. And that made all the difference. A new kind of strength. The ships that gathered at the spaceport were nothing like the sleek, polished vessels of the Coalition. There was no grandeur in the designs, no glimmering hulls or sharp, efficient lines. The ships were patched together from whatever materials they could get their hands on: scrap metal, old cargo haulers, modified civilian transports. They were rough, unrefined, and imperfect in every way. But to Jake, they were perfect. Each one was a symbol of defiance, of choice, of something bigger than what the military had ever offered him. The free companies weren't an army in the traditional sense. They were a collection of people who had chosen to fight, who had volunteered to step up when the Coalition's machine faltered. They weren't bound by uniforms or ranks or rigid military doctrine. They were free. Jake stood on the landing pad, looking out at the 12 ships, the crew members who were ready to follow him. People like Ben, Lisa, Amy, and so many others who had shown up with nothing but the willingness to fight for what was right. Jake could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, but it wasn't the kind of weight he had carried before. It wasn't a burden. It was a purpose. "Everyone ready," Jake called out as he approached the ships. Ben and Lisa were already checking equipment, and a group of volunteers was busy loading supplies. Ben looked up from a console, wiping his hands on his jacket. "Ready as we'll ever be," he grinned. "We've got the gear, we've got the ships, and we've got a damn good reason to fight. Let's go make some noise." Jake gave him a nod. Ben's words hit him in a place he didn't realize needed healing. He wasn't alone anymore. There were others who believed in the cause, who were ready to stand beside him. That kind of solidarity was rare, especially in a war where alliances were built on obligation, not choice. The crew gathered in front of the ships, their faces illuminated by the flickering lights from the hangar. They weren't soldiers. They were farmers, engineers, mechanics, students, and former soldiers. People who had heard the call to action and answered because it was the right thing to do. Some of them didn't even know what they were up against, only that the Kraith were something they couldn't ignore. That was enough. As Jake stood in front of them, he knew that this was it. This was the beginning of something new, something the Coalition couldn't control or predict. The Kraith were coming, and the free companies weren't just going to fight. They were going to fight for a reason that went beyond the typical military objectives. They were going to fight because they chose to. "All right, listen up," Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the hangar. The crew fell silent, their eyes on him. "We may not have the biggest fleet, we may not have the best weapons, but we have something no one else does. We have the choice to be here. We're not following orders. We're not part of some faceless machine. We fight because we believe in what we're doing. We fight because the people who need us are worth it. And when it gets tough, we won't stop. We'll keep fighting because it's what we choose to do." The crew stood in silence for a moment, taking in his words. And then slowly, a few of them started to clap. It wasn't much, but it was enough. One by one, others joined in until the sound of applause filled the hangar, echoing off the walls. They were ready. "Let's go show them what we're made of," Jake said, turning toward the nearest ship. The free companies had their first mission: to stop the Kraith, to protect those who couldn't defend themselves, to fight for what was right. The ships roared to life, their engines humming with power as they lifted off the ground. There was no fanfare, no military band playing, just the quiet determination of people who had chosen to fight for each other, for something bigger than themselves. As the ships broke through the atmosphere and into the vastness of space, Jake sat back in his seat, staring out the window at the stars. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Jake felt something he hadn't felt since the beginning of his service: purpose. The Kraith were formidable, their tactics unlike anything the Coalition had ever faced. Their ships were organic, almost alive, pulsating with an eerie energy. They fought in swarms, overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers. But Jake knew they weren't invincible. No enemy was. The free companies didn't need to outnumber the Kraith. They just needed to fight smarter. They needed to be unpredictable. And that's where the free companies had the advantage. "We're not like the coalition," Jake muttered to himself. "We don't fight the same way." His comms officer, a young volunteer named Sarah, looked over at him from the cockpit. "What's that, sir?" she asked. Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the crew in the rear of the ship, at the faces of men and women who had chosen to fight, who had chosen to take a stand. He knew they weren't perfect. They weren't the most experienced fighters, but they had something the coalition didn't: each other. "We're not like the coalition," Jake repeated, this time more firmly. "And that's what's going to get us through this. We fight because we choose to, not because we're ordered to." The ship continued its course toward the Varani homeworld, where the Kraith had launched their largest offensive yet. The free companies were about to take on their first real test. They knew they couldn't win a war on their own. They knew they weren't strong enough to defeat the Kraith in one battle. But they weren't here to fight alone. They were here to fight together. Jake glanced at the crew again. They were more than soldiers. They were the first of a new kind of force, one that chose to fight for the right reasons. And that, Jake thought, made them stronger than anything the Kraith could throw at them. As the ships entered the vast reaches of Coalition space, heading for the heart of the battle, Jake felt something deep inside him stir. Not hope exactly, not the naive kind of hope that people clung to when they had nothing left, but something else, something more solid: purpose. It wasn't about winning battles. It was about standing up, choosing to fight for something worth fighting for, and that kind of strength could never be taken away. The free companies were on their way, and they would fight until the very end, not because they had to, but because they chose to. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon for more amazing videos.